make no mistake, Officer Daniels has a great deal of control over the situation that he has placed himself and everybody else in. So it's the opposite of what the Sandra character has. He has a great deal of control, and by extension power, but control over the situation that he has put into play. But he doesn't have any authority at all. He doesn't have any authority. He's not a police officer. He's not an officer of the law. He's not a law enforcement official in any way, shape, or form. And the fact that he cannot be seen by the Chickwich employees leaves them the room to believe that he is an officer of the law, and so they comply with whatever it is he says, even as if they have some sneaky suspicions or at least some odd twinges in their bodies and their feelings and gut feelings that he may not be who he represents himself to be. So the interesting thing about Sandra and Officer Daniels is that they are two sides of a very odd coin, and I think those are the two characters here I think are the most fascinating characters of all in Compliance, and their rapport together is actually in a way romantic. I don't mean it in the strictest sense, but there is a sense of solace, an odd, bizarre sense of solace that they find in one another. And the charm and the sly creepiness of Officer Daniels actually resonates in the Sandra character. She is actually very ingratiated by him. She feels very ingratiated by him. She feels very, very almost flirtatious towards him and welcoming of him. I think of all the people in the film, he's the one that pays the most attention to her. I mean, she's gone through a very tough day at this restaurant. Her underlings or subordinates, if you will, have shown her a lack of respect, quite frankly, early on in the film, and so have other people. And it's ironic that this is the first time in the film, as you will see, where she actually feels as if she's being respected and that she is being paid attention to. And Officer Daniels becomes a very charming figure to her, and somebody who puts her at ease, someone who actually gives her more confidence in herself, somebody who actually believes in her. And that's something perhaps I think that Sandra as a character has not had. Certainly not in her work life, and it's left unsaid about whether she feels that in her personal life. She has a fiancé. But they don't really interact that much. We don't get many opportunities in Compliance to see her interact with her fiancé. At least in the first part of the film, we don't get to see that, and we don't get a sense that. But you feel that perhaps there is a lack of warmth and intimacy between them. Not just physical intimacy, but intimacy emotionally between them. And that's something that I find fascinating as another subtext of this film. But these two characters, specifically Sandra and Officer Daniels, intrigue me to no end, because I do think they're kind of these strangely kindred spirits that operate on a level of trying to sense each other. There's almost a strange love story between them. I mean, it's not a love story per se, but it's almost like that. In the midst of all of this chaos and really awful events that happen, and tragic events, I think they're tragic by their very nature. And nobody dies, but it's tragic in its nature that these things happened so quickly and escalated so quickly. And you'll see that in the film, that is inspired by true events. But even if the film were not inspired by true events, I do believe that a lot of the things that happen in the film are plausible, absolutely plausible. Even as ridiculous and absurd as audiences will find them to be, I think they're all plausible. And I think the characters are not stupid at all. And they're very intelligent. I've said that many times. But the focus of my commentary this time is on Sandra and on Officer Daniels. I think, in a way, they're both very lonely people, no matter what their personal background is, or what their family backgrounds may be, or what their relationship status may or may not be. They are both lonely people. Both of them are in routine situations. One of them is very, very skilled at persuasion, the art of persuasion, the art of gaining confidence. The other of them is proficient at working in a place in which people are required to just do things and not think about them. Not think about them, not deliberate about them, but just do them, execute them. And so there's no thought required. It's just this kind of rote, mechanical, routine situation. And when those two people from those two very different, or actually quite similar entity backgrounds meet over the phone, it's like there's some kind of strange alchemy going on between the two of them. And the interplay between them, I think, is very interesting. I think some audiences, though, will be frustrated, especially by the way Sandra responds to Officer Daniels. Because almost there's not just a deputizing of her own authority as a quasi-police officer by a character who has no authority whatsoever as a police officer, because he's not one, and has all the control in the world. There's an alchemy between these two people that's very interesting. And in fact, there's an elevation, I think, of Sandra's own sense of self-worth. I really do. I think there's an elevation of her own self-worth and self-esteem, much more than there is an elevation of her authority as this quasi-pseudo police officer. And I think that's what she responds to in Officer Daniels. I think she responds to that in him. And I really do believe that is how, and that is why, apart from the fact that he's so persuasive and very realistic, I think that is also why Sandra does what she does in this film. And she is so eager to please Officer Daniels. And we know that there are real-life studies that show that people in the Stockholm Syndrome phenomenon who have been held captive by their attacker, by their captor, are put in such a state of psychological paranoia, or psychological paralysis, I should say, that they are eager to praise and please their captor to the point where they exalt their captor. And it's not explicit here, but there is certainly earmarks of the Stockholm Syndrome, not only placed on poor Becky, played by Drew Walker, but also put upon the Sandra character, played by Ann Dowd so marvelously, as I said earlier, that she certainly suffers from that. Now, both Becky and Sandra are victims, but I think Sandra is certainly also a criminal here. Without question, she is. And I think certainly that Officer Daniels is a criminal. I think there's no doubt about that. And I think also you can make a case, though, that Officer Daniels is also a victim. It's not a very popular case to make, perhaps, for audiences who may have just come out of this film. But I think it's a plausible one. There are things about the film, at least in one or two shots, where we get a sense that he may not be a very confident man after all. The audiences are guaranteed to respond more to Sandra than to Officer Daniels, and by that I mean they are more likely, I believe, to respond very viscerally towards Sandra and the other Chick Witch employees with the idea of, well, how dare you, how can you do this, how could you be that stupid? And I think much of the audience response on a very gut level will be to that issue of how could you be so stupid. That will be the response, I think, in many audiences. While very few audiences, or very few audience members, will respond to how evil and callous and destructive this twisted caller is and what he does over the phone. The cowardly perverse things that he does and the evil that he brings about. And people will respond to that less, and almost, it seems to me, that that's kind of, whether intentionally or otherwise, a very tacit approval. Maybe that's a stronger word than I want it to be, but a very tacit acknowledgement of criminality without any sufficient attack or condemning of that criminality. And I think many audiences, or many people in audiences who see Compliance when it opens in August, on August 17th in the US, will bypass, for the most part, the criminal behavior, the perverse behavior, the abhorrent and immoral behavior of this cowardly phone caller who makes this prank phone call, while heaping all their outrage and visceral response onto the people at this restaurant. And I think that in and of itself is very revealing about us. We blame the victim, so to speak. We attack the victimized, but we don't sufficiently attack and condemn the victimizers. And that's very interesting to me. But my fascination remains with this film. It's very obvious, as you know. It's a fascination that I haven't felt with a film in a long time, except for perhaps, of course, The Tree of Life last year. But outside of The Tree of Life, which I thought was the best film of 2011 by far, there's an endless fascination too with Compliance, which I think here in 2012 is the best film so far this year. I wouldn't say by far, but it is the best film for many, many reasons. Because it challenges the audience, for one. Number two, it leaves the audience thinking long after it's over, and it stays with you long after it's over. And three, it's very realistically staged and directed. And all the elements of the filmmaking process are efficiently worked to a very high and sophisticated level. And the acting, of course, is top of the line as well. None of these actors, maybe with the exception of Pat Healy and perhaps Dreama Walker, have really recognized their been actors that have been around for a while, but they may not be well known to lots of audiences on a daily level here in the U.S. But they've done TV, they've done all kinds of things. But Ann Dowd is the standout here by a mile and a half, a standout. But I remain amazed by these two characters, Sandra and Officer Daniels, because they really do form this kind of bond, a very emotional bond in a very strange way, having never met each other. And yet the net effect of that interaction, that relationship, that meeting, during a very frenzied night at a restaurant over the phone, is that Sandra seems to carry an enduring romanticism for Officer Daniels as a character. Now, it's not on the surface, but I think it's very subconscious. And I think it shows later in the film, and I don't want to say exactly where in the film it shows, but I think that it shows in the film at some point that the net effect of their interaction certainly has left something in her, certainly on her face and her demeanor. And there's a charm school that she has really picked up on, and she never had this, at least initially in the film. But as the film progresses, we see this moment where she is very ingratiating towards someone, and we feel, at least I felt, that it was a very, it was down to the net result of her interactions with Officer Daniels. And I think it's an absolutely chilling moment. It's a sweet moment. It's an innocent moment in a way. It's a flirtatious and charming moment, but it's also very chilling. It's that last imprint that someone leaves on you, and how that gets replicated and learned and subsumed and consumed. And goodness gracious, you could write a book about just those two characters alone.